For 100 years, the world changed under a storm that never ended. Lightning split the sky day and night, reshaping everything that lived beneath it. Winds grew strong enough to tear ancient forests apart, uprooting trees that had stood for centuries and smashing them into the ground. Thunder rolled like a living heartbeat across the horizon, pulsing through mountains, valleys, and oceans, reminding every creature that the sky was now in control. And inside this endless turbulence, evolution began again. Not slowly, not gently, but violently and without mercy. At first, nothing dared rise into the electric sky. The storms were too unpredictable, too aggressive, too unforgiving. Anything that tried to fly was thrown back to the ground like ash in a furnace. But nature never accepts defeat. Along cliffs and jagged ridges, small creatures began testing the dangerous air in brief, terrified leaps. They jumped, glided, and fell, their fragile bodies whipped around by invisible hands of wind. Most never rose again, yet a few survived long enough for change to take hold, passing on tiny advantages written in bone, muscle, and instinct. Wings grew lighter, shedding unnecessary weight that only dragged their owners downward. Bones hollowed and became more flexible, bending under sudden gusts instead of snapping. Eyes developed layered lenses to filter the blinding flashes of lightning, allowing them to see shapes and paths even in the brightest storms. Membranes thickened with microscopic fibers that resisted electric burns and churning rain. In just a few generations, what once seemed impossible slowly became instinct. Creatures no longer feared the storm as an unstoppable enemy. Bit by bit, they learned to ride it. They stretched their wings into winds that could lift entire trees out of the soil. They dove between towering columns of lightning, reading the hidden structure of the storm like a map drawn in the air. They glided using pressure waves shaped by thunder itself, letting shock fronts push them forward without a single wind beat. As their world became more violent, their movements became more precise, faster, sharper, more controlled. Survival was no longer about hiding in caves and hoping the storm would pass. Survival belonged to those who could dance with it. Then came the first true hunters of the sky. These were predators built not for sunlight, but for stormlight. Their feathers were coated in natural insulation, bending energy around their bodies so that lightning crawled over them without burning. Their crests stored static electricity, glowing faintly with each heartbeat like living storm beacons. Their talons locked onto wet stone as easily as dry bark, letting them perch in the middle of howling winds. And their wings carved clean lines through the rain like blades of obsidian, slicing through air that would shred lesser creatures. They learned to stalk prey not from above, but from within the lightning itself. Hidden inside blinding flashes, they could appear and disappear in an instant, their silhouettes visible only for a fraction of a second. A single dive, silent and precise, was enough to end a chase before it truly began. Smaller gliders scattered at the first flicker of blue-white light, knowing that somewhere inside that brightness, something was falling toward them. Every creature that lived on the ground trembled when the storms grew bright and close. Because bright storms meant one thing: the sky tyrants were hunting. On cliff faces, small herds huddled under overhangs, listening to the roar of wind as if it were a language. They waited for the rhythm of thunder to change, because they knew what followed. First came the long rolling boom, then came the crack of lightning, and then, in the quiet space between, the real danger arrived: a shadow folding its wings into a perfect dive. For the ground dwellers, the sky was no longer a distant ceiling. It had teeth. Over time, the sky tyrants rose higher and higher. Each generation pushed beyond the limits of the last, reaching altitudes where the air was thin, cold, and charged with invisible rivers of electricity. Some mastered the mid-level winds, riding chaotic layers of pressure that twisted and collided like colliding ocean currents. Others became canyon specialists, darting between cliffs with impossible agility, using the rock face itself to shield them from sudden gusts. They mapped every pattern the wind could follow and turned those patterns into weapons. But one lineage grew larger, stronger, and more dominant than all the rest. These giants were the titans of the upper sky. Their wings were wide enough to cast moving shadows across entire valleys, darkening the land below as they passed. Their muscles were built to withstand wind forces that could crush stone, absorbing sudden shocks without losing balance. Their senses were tuned to the electric patterns inside the clouds. They felt each lightning channel before it formed, using it as a guide rather than a threat. They did not simply fly through storms, hoping to survive. They moved as if the storms were built around them, They did not fly through storms, they ruled them. For decades, their silhouettes circled above the world, masters of a kingdom made entirely of thunder and cloud. Lightning illuminated their wings every few seconds, revealing titans that seemed almost carved from the storm itself. To the creatures below, they looked less like animals and more like living pieces of the sky. Herds on the ground could only watch in distant awe or hide in deep fear as the clouds pulsed with power and shadows moved inside the light. The storm era belonged to them, and for a long time, nothing challenged their reign. Life on the ground reshaped itself around their presence. Herd animals changed migration routes, avoiding open plains whenever the sky turned dark. Smaller predators shifted to nocturnal hunting, waiting for rare nights when the clouds finally broke. Even rivers and forests seemed quieter during the worst storms, as if the whole world was holding its breath while the tyrants passed overhead. In this age, survival was not just a matter of strength or speed, it was a matter of listening to the sky and learning when to disappear. High in the clouds, the tyrants fought battles no creature on the ground ever fully saw. They tested one another in spiraling duels, circling around columns of thunder, banking so hard that their wingtips scraped the tops of storm clouds. Sometimes a loser fell for miles before recovering. Sometimes it never rose again. Scars traced the length of their wings and necks, pale lines where lightning had grazed or talons had torn. Silent records of storms survived and rivals defeated. They were not mindless beasts. Within family lines, younger tyrants learned by following older ones through the harshest weather, copying every tilt of the wing and every calculated dive. They remembered the safest updrafts, the most treacherous crosswinds, the timing of seasonal storms. Generation after generation, knowledge was passed not in words, but in flight paths carved through the air. The sky itself became their history book, but the world never remains the same. No age, no matter how fierce, lasts forever. Storms that once raged endlessly began to weaken and drift apart. Rain fell softer, turning from hammering sheets into steady, gray curtains. Lightning flashed less often, fading from constant chains into rare, scattered strikes. The wind, once alive and hostile, grew colder and thinner, losing some of the raw strength that had shaped these titans. On the far edges of the horizon, something strange began to appear, long streaks of white clinging to mountaintops and shorelines. Ice was forming where fire and storm once ruled. The planet was preparing for another transformation. The Sky Tyrants felt the shift first, long before it was obvious to anything below. Their wings, made for warm electric currents, began to freeze along the edges during high-altitude flights. Thin layers of ice crept across their feathers, adding weight and stealing lift. Their light bones, once perfect for gliding, struggled to hold elevation in the denser, colder air. Hunting became harder as updrafts weakened and storm walls thinned. Gliding became dangerous as the air turned unpredictable in new ways. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the storm kingdom began to shrink. One by one, the tyrants descended to lower altitudes, searching for the old warmth that no longer existed. Some pushed too high and paid the price, falling from the sky mid-flight as ice stiffened their wings into brittle sheets. Others tried to adapt by flying less and waiting more, ambushing from cliffs instead of clouds, their once dominant silhouettes reduced to brief, desperate strikes. The once glowing crests on their heads dimmed as the air lost its electric charge, their stored energy fading with each passing season. On a world turning white, the rulers of thunder faced their final, quiet enemy, the cold. When the last of them glided over the frozen plains, their shadows looked smaller than ever against the vast, pale landscape. No lightning illuminated their wings now. No endless storm roared above them. The sky grew still and strangely silent, stripped of the chaos that had once given them life. The lightning faded into memory. And the era of flight ended not with a final heroic battle in the clouds, but with a long, quiet fall into obscurity. Yet beneath the ice, something else stirred in the growing darkness. Massive shapes drifted slowly in the blue depths of the newly chilled oceans, far below the reach of wind. Ancient forms, adapted not for speed or lightning, but for pressure and cold, began to move. They felt no fear of the silence that had defeated the Sky Tyrants. For them, silence was home. The same stillness that killed the storm rulers simply cleared the stage for a different kind of power. The world was no longer shaped by storms from above. It would now be carved by weight and ice from below. A new age was rising, built on glaciers, frozen seas, and the crushing pressure of the deep. In this coming era, strength would not belong to those who could outrun the wind, but to those who could endure centuries beneath ice and darkness without breaking. For all their power, the world would remember them only through traces: a fossilized claw weathered by ice, a single feather preserved in ancient sediment, storm myths whispered by distant descendants who never knew their true shape. Long after their shadows vanished from the clouds, the echo of their age would linger in stories about a time when thunder had wings. And soon, from under the thickest sheets of ice, the true heirs of this frozen planet would rise, the colossal beings the later world would remember as the ice leviathans, rulers not of thunder, but of the drowned and frozen earth. Their rise would mark the beginning of a chapter even more immense and unforgiving than the age of storms that came before.